Have you ever heard a story that starts out ordinary and then cracks open into something you never saw coming? Well, what you're about to hear isn't just surprising. It's the kind of twist that makes you stop, breathe, and question everything you thought you knew. It begins with a moment so small, so harmless, that anyone could have missed it, but not her, and definitely not you, not after today. Because as this story unfolds, every detail becomes a clue. Every silence becomes a warning. And every choice leads deeper into a truth that refuses to stay hidden. So before we begin, take a second, get comfortable. And whatever you do, don't look away. This is one story you'll want to hear until the very end. And hey, if you enjoy stories that pull you in and keep your heart racing, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps the story reach more people, and it tells me you want more. Ready? Let's begin. The first contraction hit like a fist from the inside, and Grace Cole nearly dropped her phone right there in the marble lobby of St. Mark's Medical Center. She clutched the edge of the check-in desk and forced a smile at the startled receptionist. "I am fine," Grace said through gritted teeth. "Just timing contractions in public. Super glamorous." The receptionist, a young guy with a nervous smile and a name badge that read Tyler, hopped to his feet. "Ma'am, we can get you up to labor and delivery right now." Grace nodded and tried to breathe the way she had taught 100 other women when she used to be an emergency room nurse. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Calm, controlled. She checked her phone again. No new messages from Ethan. Her husband, Ethan Cole, was the kind of millionaire people wrote puff pieces about. Tech genius, self-made, a face that looked good under studio lighting, and a smile polished by public relations teams. At least that was the version the world liked. The version Grace knew was charming and restless, always pacing, always building, always promising he would slow down after the next deal, after the next funding round, after the next keynote. He had promised to be here. "Call me the second it starts, babe," he had said the night before, kissing her forehead as if that alone could erase the months of missed dinners and rescheduled doctor appointments. "I would not miss this for anything." Now the nurse was wheeling a chair toward her, and Ethan was still just 3 dots on a message thread, stuck on typing, never sending. They got her into the wheelchair, and the world narrowed to the squeak of rubber wheels and the sting of antiseptic. She had walked these halls in scrubs once, back when she was the one pushing patients, not the one gripping the sides of the chair. Bennett Carter met her halfway down the corridor. Tall, slightly disheveled, wearing a white coat over sneakers that had seen better days, he gave her a quick once-over and then an easy grin. "Well, Mrs. Cole," he said, "looks like this kid actually read the due date on the chart. How considerate." Grace tried to laugh, but another contraction rolled through her. "Feels more like he skipped the fine print," she said. They rolled past the nurse's station, past rows of closed doors and quiet monitors. The labor and delivery floor always smelled like a strange mix of fear, bleach, and hope. Grace had loved it once. Today it felt like the edge of a cliff. "Where is Ethan?" Doc Carter asked, glancing around as he walked alongside the chair. "On his way," Grace said. "Big investor call this morning. He said he would wrap it up." "Ah, yes," Carter said dryly. "Nothing like a little venture capital to spice up a birth plan." The joke landed just enough to make her smile. He always did that, lightening the air just enough to keep panic from taking root. Another contraction hit. Stronger. Closer. She clenched the armrests. "How far apart?" Carter asked. "About 5 minutes," the nurse answered for her. "Sometimes 4. Grace tried to focus on the ceiling tiles as they turned a corner. She counted vents, lights, tiny cracks in the paint. She reminded herself she had seen worse. Gunshot wounds, car crashes. She had talked families through news that shattered their world. She could handle labor. At the far end of the hallway, someone laughed. The sound was sharp in the quiet, a bright little bubble of amusement that did not belong on this floor. Grace squinted down the corridor. 2 figures stood near a side door. A man in a dark suit, broad shoulders she knew like her own heartbeat. A woman in a fitted navy dress, red heels, glossy hair. Even at a distance, Ethan's posture was familiar. The tilt of his head when he was making someone feel like they were the only person in the world. Grace's chest loosened with relief. He is here, she thought. He made it. Ethan, she called or tried to, but the word got tangled with a contraction and came out as a strained breath. The nurse pushing her chair slowed. Is that him? The nurse asked carefully. Before Grace could answer, the woman in heels reached for Ethan's arm. She leaned in close, lips near his ear. Ethan smiled, that easy, media-trained curve of his mouth, and slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her into a hug. The world did not exactly stop. It simply tilted. Grace watched, helpless, as the man who was supposed to be holding her hand while she brought their son into the world held Madison Hale instead. She knew Madison. Everyone in Ethan's orbit knew Madison. Public relations director, crisis whisperer, the woman the media loved just as much as they loved Ethan. Smart, poised, always by his side in group photos. Not like this. Grace's hand slid off the armrest of the wheelchair. Ethan, she said again, but the name was different now. Less like a greeting, more like a bruise. The nurse followed her eye in and froze for half a heartbeat. The chair bumped to a stop. "Sir, we need to get through," the nurse called down the hall. Ethan looked up. His eyes met Grace's across the bright, sterile space, and for a moment he looked almost startled, like a man who had walked into the wrong room by mistake. But his arm did not drop from Madison's shoulders. Grace heard the monitor on the portable pole beside her begin to beep faster. She felt her throat tighten. The contraction hit at the wrong angle, on the wrong breath, stacked on top of something that was not physical at all. It slammed through her chest, and then everything inside her went light and dizzy. Hey, Grace, look at me," Dr. Carter said, suddenly very close, his face filling her vision. "Do not lock your breath up. In, out, eyes on me, not on them. They do not matter right now. You and this baby do." But his voice sounded far away. The world narrowed to a bright bar of light on the floor, and the image of Ethan's hand resting on the small of Madison's back, exactly where he used to touch Grace. Another beep. Another. Then the monitor's steady rhythm flatlined into a long, unbroken tone. "Blood pressure dropping," the nurse said sharply. "She is going pale." Grace tried to speak, to tell them it hurt, that it was too much, that something had cracked wide open inside her, but the words would not come. The hallway swam, the walls stretched long and unfocused. She felt the chair lurch forward as they started moving again. Fast now. "Call a code in labor and delivery," Dr. Carter snapped. "Now." There was a camera in the corner of the ceiling. Grace saw the tiny red light blink as they rushed under it. Saw the way it caught everything without judgment. Ethan's suit, Madison's heels, the way her own hand slipped uselessly off the side of the chair. The last clear thought she had before the world tipped into white noise was that somebody, somewhere, would watch this later. And they would see exactly what she had seen. They would see him choose. Then the hallway disappeared and Grace fell into the dark. Somewhere in the dark, there was beeping. At first it was far away, like a car alarm in a distant parking lot. Slowly, gradually, the sound moved closer until it was the only thing tethering Grace to the surface. Beep, beep, beep. She tried to open her eyes. Her lashes felt glued together. "Hey," a voice said softly. "Grace, if you can hear me, this is the part in the movie where the hero wakes up and tells the doctor he looks terrible on camera." Dr. Bennett Carter. She knew that voice, that dry humor stretching over something tight and worried. She forced her eyes open. The world swam into focus in pieces. A ceiling she did not recognize. Lines running into her arm. An oxygen cannula under her nose. The dull ache in her abdomen told its own story, one she had seen in countless charts. C-section. Her hand flew automatically to her stomach, then slowed when she felt the thick dressing and the tug of pain. "It is okay," Dr. Carter said, stepping into view. "Well, okay is a strong word, but you and your son are both alive. That is a pretty solid starting point." "My son," Grace whispered. Her voice sounded like sandpaper. "Is he?" "In the neonatal intensive care unit," Carter said. "He had a rough start, but he is stabilizing. He is a fighter. Little Peanut has opinions." Relief flooded her so hard her eyes stung. "What happened?" she asked. "You had what we call a perfect storm," Carter said. He checked her vitals as he spoke, casual tone over practiced hands. Labor stress, sudden blood pressure crash, a lovely shot of emotional trauma right when your body needed stability. Your uterus was not thrilled with the situation, and neither was your heart. We had to move fast. The hallway flickered at the edge of her memory. Ethan, Madison, the hug. It was real, she said aloud before she could stop herself. What was real? Carter asked. She swallowed. Her throat hurt. Ethan, she said, in the hallway, with Madison. I saw them. Something flickered in Carter's eyes, there and gone. I am not your marriage counselor, he said carefully, but I am your doctor. And as your doctor, I can tell you that what you felt in that moment was enough to drop your blood pressure like a rock. That is not nothing. He adjusted her drip, then added more softly, and yes, it was real. The room went very quiet. How do you know? She asked. Carter sighed. He glanced at the corner of the ceiling. Because this hospital has cameras, he said, and one of them was looking straight at you when you went down. Grace followed his gaze. A small dome sat in the corner, almost invisible, a tiny red light blinking. Someone reviewed the footage? She asked. Our security team did, Carter said. Then shortly after sunrise, our legal department got a call from a certain tech company asking to discuss data retention policies. Ethan, Grace said. Ethan, Carter agreed, and his public relations director. They were very interested in making sure we were, quote, aligned on messaging. Grace stared at the blank television mounted on the wall across from her bed. There was no sound now except the steady beep of the monitor and the slow hiss of oxygen. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, thin and insistent. So he wants the camera to lie for him, she said. He wants the camera to disappear, Carter answered. Big difference. He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. Listen carefully, Grace, he said. Right now, you have two priorities. One, heal. Two, meet your son. Everything else is noise. But I am not going to pretend that the rest of it is not there. Legal is scrambling. Administration is nervous. And people with money are very good at making inconvenient files vanish. Grace let that sink in. She had seen it in the emergency room too. Cases that got massaged before they reached the press. Files that went missing. Stories that shifted depending on who was telling them. What happens if the footage disappears? She asked. Carter's jaw tightened. Then it is your word against a very polished narrative, he said, and I have seen how that tends to go. He checked her chart again, then gave her a wry look. By the way, he added, this is not medical advice, but if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to control the story, document everything. Screenshots, copies, witnesses. Never rely on one file in one place. Back up your backup, Grace murmured. Exactly, he said. Now drink some water so I do not have to chart that you ignored doctor's orders on your first day as a mom. He held a straw to her lips. The cool water soothed her throat. For a moment, she let herself just exist in her body. Alive, sore, exhausted, still here. When Carter left, the room felt larger and emptier. Grace turned her head slowly, taking in the flowers someone had already sent, the stack of pamphlets about postpartum recovery, the visitor chair in the corner. The chair was empty. She was not sure why that hurt more than it should. Technically, Ethan could be in a meeting or speaking to doctors or down in the neonatal unit or doing 100 other things that were not sitting in that chair. But the absence felt like an answer anyway. The door opened with a soft click. Hey, a familiar voice said. Sleeping Beauty is awake. Grace's mother, Ellen, stepped into the room with a paper coffee cup in one hand and a hospital visitor badge clipped to her sweater. Lines of worry etched her face deeper than the last time Grace had really looked at her. Mom, Grace said. Ellen crossed the room in 3 quick steps and brushed a hand over Grace's hair. You scared me half to death, she said, voice while trembling. When they called and said they had taken you into emergency surgery, I thought... She did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. Baby? Grace asked. In the neonatal unit, Ellen said, eyes softening. Tiny, but fierce. He grabbed my finger and would not let go, just like you when you were little. Grace smiled, and for a moment, everything else blurred at the edges. She had a son. He was real. He was breathing. Then the image of the hallway shoved its way back in. "Did you see Ethan?" she asked. Ellen's mouth tightened. "He was here briefly," she said. "He gave a statement to some hospital people. Then he said he had to deal with, quote, a situation." "A situation," Grace repeated. "I saw Madison with him," Ellen added quietly. "The one from television. The one they always describe as his right hand." "That is one way to put it," Grace said. They sat in silence for a beat. "You know," Ellen said eventually, "when your father walked out, I kept telling myself there was something I was missing. Some angle that made it make sense. Some reason that would make the betrayal smaller. There never was." Grace looked at her. "Universal problem with humans," Ellen went on, a half-smile tugging at her lips. "We would rather wrap ourselves in a lie than stand naked in an ugly truth. Somewhere between 20% and 30% of us go through this exact same debate at some point. Stay and pretend, or open our eyes and see everything." Grace swallowed. The dilemma tasted familiar. "Right now," Ellen said, squeezing her hand, "you do not have to decide anything. You just have to breathe. The rest will still be there tomorrow." Someone knocked softly on the doorframe. Mrs. Cole," a tentative voice said. Grace looked up. A young woman stood there in hospital scrubs a size too big, a badge that read, "Lucy Grant," clipped into her pocket. She pushed her glasses up with one nervous finger. "I am sorry, I do not want to interrupt," Lucy said. I just, I needed to bring these." She held up a small plastic envelope with a wristband and a tiny printed tag inside. "This is your son's band," she said. "Mr. Cole, well, he was supposed to deliver it, but he got a call and had to step out." Of course he did, Grace thought. Out loud, she just said, "Thank you, Lucy." Lucy hesitated at the foot of the bed. "I was on security rotation last night," she blurted finally. "On the monitors, I saw what happened in the hallway. I just wanted you to know you are not crazy." The relief hit so suddenly, Grace almost laughed. "Good to hear," she said. "My track record on that has been shaky lately." Lucy smiled, quick and awkward. "They are talking about wiping the footage," she said in a rush. "Legal said something about privacy, and then someone from Cole Dynamics called, and now everyone is walking around looking like they swallowed a lawsuit." "Lucy," Ellen said gently, "are you supposed to be telling us this?" "Definitely not," Lucy said, "but sometimes supposed to and right are not the same thing." She shifted her weight, then lowered her voice. "Security that saves auto backups for 24 hours, she said. Then the system overwrites. I pulled a copy to local storage before anyone asked, just in case. I thought, if it were me, I would want proof that I was not imagining it." Grace stared at her. "You have the footage," she said. "Yes," Lucy said. "On a drive. Off network." Ellen let out a slow breath. "Then keep it safe," she said. Lucy nodded. "I plan to," she said. "For what it is worth, Mrs. Cole, what he did in that hallway, that is on him, not on you. Do not let anyone tell you a different story." She left as quickly as she had come. Grace lay back against the pillows, heart thudding a little faster. There was a copy. For the first time since she had woken up, she felt something thin and sharp slide in under the exhaustion. Hope. 3 days blurred into a rhythm of pain medication, short walks with a nurse at her elbow, and visits to the neonatal unit where Grace stood over a plastic bassinet and watched her son breathe. They named him Noah. He was small, all soft skin and flailing limbs, wires taped to his chest like a miniature science experiment. Every time his fingers wrapped around hers, she felt something inside her reassemble. Ethan came and went. He arrived once with a bouquet so large it needed its own chair, and a photographer from his company shadowing him under the guise of documenting this special time. "Turn a little this way," the photographer said as Ethan leaned over the bassinet. "Perfect. Proud dad moment." Grace stood a small distance away, arms folded, watching. When Ethan tried to put an arm around her, she stepped aside as if she had not seen his hand. He covered the awkward beat with a laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Still mad at me for missing the big entrance," she said lightly. You know how these investor calls go. I know how hugs in hallways go, she replied. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, then loosened. Grace, you were under a lot of stress, he said. You saw 1 second of something and your brain did the rest. Madison was comforting me. We had just gotten some tough news about a partnership deal. Do you always comfort your public relations director by holding her like that? Grace asked. The photographer cleared his throat and pretended to adjust his lens. Ethan lowered his voice. This is not the place, he said. You are right, Grace said. The place for that conversation was 3 days ago in a hallway before I hit the floor. Later, alone in her room, she replayed the moment in her head, the casual way he had twisted the story, the way he had tried to fold her reality into his version. Gaslighting. She had seen it before, in couples who came into the emergency room after accidents, in parents who insisted their kids were clumsy when the bruises said otherwise. If someone ever makes you doubt what you know you saw, write it down, Dr. Carter had said when he checked on her. Trauma is slippery. It will let people rewrite it if you do not pin it to the page. So Grace wrote. She kept a small notebook by her bed and scribbled down every detail she could remember. The angle of Ethan's hand on Madison's back, the sound of their laughter, the exact words he used when he tried to explain it away. Meanwhile, Lucy worked in the background. On the fourth day, Lucy knocked on the door of Grace's room again, eyes darting up and down the hall before she slipped inside. I did something, she said. Good something or subpoena something? Grace asked. Depends who you ask, Lucy replied. I made a copy of the footage for you. She pulled a small silver flash drive from her pocket and held it up like contraband. It is password protected, she said. I set the password to your maiden name and your birth year, spelled out in words. Ellen raised an eyebrow. You know my maiden name, she said. I checked your visitor records, Lucy said, then winced, in a totally non-creepy, mildly illegal way. Grace took the drive. It felt heavier than it should in her hand. This could blow up your job, she said quietly. Lucy shrugged. If they fire me for not deleting evidence, I probably do not want to work here anyway, she said. I am good with machines, but I still have to look at myself in the mirror. She pointed at the corner of the room where the hospital television hung. You can plug it into that, she said, if you want to watch it. For a long moment, Grace just held the drive. Part of her did not want to see it. Seeing meant she could not pretend maybe she had misinterpreted things. Seeing meant the hallway would become a fixed point, no longer distorted by pain or fear. But she had spent enough years watching people choose the gentler story over the true one. She had seen what it cost them. Take bam, she said to Lucy. Lucy nodded and moved to stand by the wall, almost as if she wanted to be close enough to help, but far enough not to intrude. Ellen took the remote and turned the television to the input menu. The hospital had clearly not designed these TVs for personal flash drives. It took a few tries and one muttered comment from Ellen about cheap corporate contracts before the screen flickered and the security interface appeared. A silent hallway filled the frame. The timestamp sat in the corner. Grace recognized the exact minute her world had shifted. There, Lucy said softly. Hit play. Grace watched herself, small and pale on the gurney, being pushed down the corridor. She watched the doors open at the far end. Ethan and Madison appeared, side by side. Every detail she had written in her notebook showed up on the screen. Madison's hand on his sleeve. The way Ethan leaned toward her, lips near her ear. The hug. The half-second of hesitation from the nurse as she saw what Grace saw. Then Grace watched herself reach out, fingers trembling, and saw them drop as her body sagged. The recording did not care about excuses. It did not care about context. It simply captured the choice. By the time the video ended, Grace's hands were shaking, but her mind felt strangely clear. Well, Ellen said quietly, there goes the last benefit of the doubt. Lucy cleared her throat. So, she said, practically speaking, you have two options. You can keep this for yourself, like a private truth, or you can use it. Use it how? Grace asked. Lucy looked uncomfortable. If this were a story online, she said slowly, and people saw that clip with the right headline, I do not think the court of public opinion would side with him. Even millionaires look bad in high definition. Grace thought of the way Ethan controlled every interview, every photo, every public statement. She thought of how good he was at bending narratives until they snapped into place around him. "And if I leak it?" she asked. "What happens then?" "Then it is out," Lucy said simply. "He cannot bury it without making it worse. Hospitals talk, journalists dig. Once people see that hug next to your collapse, they will make their own judgment." Grace slid the drive into her palm and closed her fingers around it. For the first time since the birth, she felt like she was holding something solid in a situation that had been entirely slippery. "This is your decision," Ellen said. "You do not owe the world your pain, but you also do not owe him your silence." Grace nodded slowly. "I need to think," she said, "and I need to see Noah again before I decide anything." Lucy shifted her weight. "Just one more thing," she said. "If you do decide to use it, do not send it from your own account first. Find someone with reach. Someone whose job is telling stories that powerful people hate." "Like a journalist," Ellen said. "Exactly," Lucy replied. "The kind that scares corporations." Later that afternoon, Ethan came by again. He sat in the visitor chair, scrolling through his phone while Grace dozed. When she woke, he was on a call, voice smooth and practiced. "No, we are fine," he said into his headset. "Grace is recovering. The baby is stable. Legally, the hospital is cooperating. We just need to make sure no one misinterprets anything. People love to take things out of context." Grace watched him. The words misinterprets and context tasted bitter now. When he hung up, he smiled at her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Sore," she said. "Tired. Watching my husband manage his image from a hospital chair. The usual." He winced. "Grace, come on," he said. "That is not fair." "What would be fair?" she asked. "Red heels banned from the maternity wing? A moratorium on side hugs while your wife is in labor?" He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for once. "I told you nothing happened," he said. "It was a stressful morning. Madison was supporting me. I had just gotten off a brutal call. You know how much pressure I am under." "Oh, I know you were under someone," Grace said. "I am less clear on who was supporting whom." He stared at her. "You are being dramatic," he said finally. Once that word would have made her question herself. Now, with the image of the hallway still fresh in her mind, it only made her tired. "You know what dramatic is?" she asked. "Watching yourself collapse on a monitor because your body could not hold any more of what your heart was carrying. That is dramatic." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "This is not how I imagined this week," he said. "Me neither," she replied. That night, when the floor quieted and the nurses dimmed the lights, Grace lay awake listening to the soft sounds of the hospital. She thought about the flash drive hidden in the lining of her overnight bag, about Lucy's anxious courage, about the way Ethan's voice had shifted when he talked to his team versus when he talked to her. Somewhere between the beeps and the humming, she realized something important. Right now, Ethan had more power than she did. He had money, lawyers, public relations teams. But there was one thing he could not control if she chose to let it go. The truth caught on camera. In the middle of the night, she whispered to the dark. "If someone else were in my place," she said, "what would I tell her to do?" The answer came from the part of her that had held strangers' hands in the emergency room at 3 in the morning. The part that knew what it meant to stand on the edge of a decision that would change everything. She would tell her not to fight alone. She would tell her to find someone whose job it was to shine a light where people wanted darkness. Grace exhaled. In the morning, she asked Lucy for the name of an investigative reporter who scared corporations. The first thing Grace noticed was the sound. Beep, beep, beep. Not fast, not slow, just steady. A metronome pulling her out of the dark. She floated for a moment between sleep and waking, aware of weight and pain and something tight across her abdomen. Then a voice cut through the fog, dry and familiar. "Okay, plot twist," the voice said. "You are still here. That is my favorite kind of twist." Grace forced her eyes open. The ceiling above her was not the one from the hallway. This one was wider, cleaner, with a soft reflection of monitor lights. Her mouth felt dry. An oxygen cannula rested under her nose. Her arm was tethered to an IV pole by lines of clear tubing. Bennett Carter leaned into her field of vision. His hair was a little messier than usual, and there were faint shadows under his eyes, but his smile held. "Hey there, Mrs. Cole," he said quietly. "Welcome back to the land of the loudly beeping." Grace tried to speak. What came out was a croak. "My baby," she rasped. Carter nodded, already answering before she could panic. "In the neonatal intensive care unit," he said. "Small but loud. APGAR scores are decent considering the crash we had. He needed help at first, but he is breathing on his own now. That kid has opinions about life." Relief hit her so hard her eyes blurred. "What happened?" she whispered. Carter checked the monitor, then pulled a chair closer and sat down. "You had what we like to call a perfect disaster," he said. "Labor stress, sudden blood pressure drop, an emotional grenade going off at exactly the wrong second. Your body slammed on the brakes. We had to go in for an emergency C-section to save both of you." The hallway flickered back into her mind. The lights, the gurney turning, Ethan's arm around Madison, the way the world tilted before it went dark. "It was real," she said. Carter tilted his head. "What was real?" he asked. She swallowed, throat raw. "I saw Ethan," she said, "at the end of the hall, with Madison. He was holding her, laughing." Her voice shook. "It was not a dream. I saw that, and then everything dropped." For a heartbeat, Carter's eyes hardened. It was gone so fast she almost missed it, replaced by his usual dry calm. "You did not hallucinate," he said. "You did not imagine it. You did not overreact. And yes, it was real." Grace stared at him. "How do you know?" she asked. He nodded toward the corner of the room. "Because hospitals are paranoid," he said. "We have cameras everywhere. One of them was watching that hallway." Grace followed his gaze. A small black dome sat near the ceiling, a tiny red light blinking steadily. "The security team pulled the footage," Carter went on. "Then legal pulled it. Then just after sunrise, Coal Dynamics called and asked about, and I quote, aligning on messaging, which is rich because I thought this was a maternity ward, not a public relations set." The words landed like stones in her stomach. "He wants it gone," she said. "He wants the camera to lie for him, to him." "Close," Carter said. "He wants the camera to disappear. Lying takes effort. Erasing is cleaner." He leaned his elbows on his knees and looked at her with the kind of seriousness he usually reserved for terrible lab results. "Grace, listen," he said. "Right now, as your doctor, my top priorities are simple. 1, your heart stays beating. 2, your incision heals. 3, you meet your son. Everything else is extra, but I am not going to pretend the rest does not matter." He lowered his voice. "I have worked in enough hospitals to know what happens when powerful people get nervous," he said. "Files get lost, footage gets corrupted, stories get rewritten. If that video goes, it becomes your word against a very carefully curated narrative. And that is a fight no one should have to take on alone." Grace let out a shaky breath. "I feel stupid," she said. "Like I should have seen this coming. The late nights, the business trips, the way he always said Madison understood the pressure he was under." "You are not stupid," Carter said. "You are human. Humans see what we want to see until reality smacks us in the face. Then our hearts drop faster than our blood pressure." She almost laughed at that, then winced when the movement tugged at her stitches. "Do you think I am overreacting?" she asked quietly. Carter leaned back, studying her. "You want the medical answer or the human one?" he asked. "Both," she said. "Medically," he said, "your body hit the overload button. Emotional shock absolutely can trigger a crash, especially in someone already under stress. You did not decide to drop your blood pressure for dramatic effect. Your nervous system did that all by itself." He paused. "Human answer," he added. "If my partner hugged their colleague like that while I was on a gurney and then tried to convince me I had imagined it, I would be pissed. Also, I would probably write myself a note about it so I could not be talked out of what I saw later." "Write it down," Grace murmured. "Document it." Carter nodded. "That is my non-medical tip of the day," he said. "When someone makes you question your reality, you write your reality down. Trauma is slippery. It lets people rewrite it if you do not pin it to the page." He stood. "I am going to check on your labs," he said. "Your mom is in the family lounge. She will be in as soon as I tell her she is allowed to smother you." As he reached the door, he paused. "And Grace," he said without turning around, "I do not know how this plays out, but I do know this. Whatever story starts running out there, that camera saw the same one you did. It is not crazy. It is not hysterical. It is evidence." He left. The room was quiet again except for the monitor and the faint whoosh of air through a vent. Grace stared at the ceiling for a long minute, trying to separate physical pain from the ache sitting behind her ribs. The door opened softly. Her mother Ellen slipped into the room with a cardboard coffee cup in hand, visitor badge hanging crooked from her sweater. Her eyes were red around the edges. "Hey, kiddo," Ellen said, voice soft. "Look at you, scaring 10 years off my life." Grace smiled weakly. "Hi, Mom," she said. Ellen set the coffee on the tray and bent to kiss her forehead, careful of the IV lines. "When they called and said emergency surgery," she said, "I drove here breaking at least 3 traffic laws. Do not tell your doctor that part." "Pretty sure he has seen worse," Grace said. Ellen pulled the visitor chair closer and sat. "I saw him. Your son," she said, "in that little plastic box. He wrapped his hand around my finger and would not let go, just like you did that first night in the hospital in Columbus. Except you screamed more." Well, Grace's throat tightened. "Is he okay?" she asked. "For a tiny, furious human who just crash-landed, he is doing all right," Ellen said. "The nurses all adore him. They called him a fighter. They also called him loud, which tracks." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the presence of a new life fill the space between the beeps. Then Grace said, "Did you see Ethan?" Ellen's mouth thinned. "I saw him briefly," she said. "He was with hospital legal, talking about liability and privacy and other words that make my skin crawl. Madison was there too, in heels, in a maternity ward. That tells you something right there." Grace swallowed. "Mom," she said quietly, "I am not crazy. I saw them in the hallway. Together." Ellen nodded. "I know," she said. "I saw enough to know something was off. When your father walked out on me, I spent a lot of time explaining his behavior to myself. Work stress, midlife crisis, childhood trauma. Anything except the simple truth that he chose to leave." She looked at Grace, her eyes steady. "There is a moment," she said, "for a lot of us, somewhere between 20% and 30% of our lives, where we hit this wall. Stay in the lie and keep the family picture intact, or open our eyes and watch it crack. It is a universal dilemma. You do not have to solve it today, but you need to know you are not the first one to stand here." Grace stared at the blanket, tracing a crease with her finger. "I do not know what to do," she admitted. "Then do the thing you do know how to do," Ellen said. "Heal. Be a mom. Let the rest sit for a hot minute." A soft knock sounded on the doorframe. Mrs. Cole?" a shy voice asked. Grace looked up. A young woman in slightly oversized scrubs hovered there, glasses sliding down her nose. Her badge read Lucy Grant, ITE support. "Yes?" Grace said. "I am sorry to bother you," Lucy said, stepping inside. "I was asked to bring you this." She held up a small plastic bag with a tiny hospital bracelet inside. The tag read Baby Cole, pre-printed in neat black text. "That is your son's ID band copy," Lucy said. "Mr. Cole was supposed to deliver it, but he had to take a call." Of course he did, Grace thought. "Thank you," she said alone. Lucy hesitated, gripping the bag a bit tighter before setting it on the side table. I, I was also on security rotation last night," she blurted. "In the control room, watching the camera feeds." She pushed her glasses up, cheeks flushing. "I saw what happened. In the hallway, I just wanted you to know that someone else did too." Something inside Grace loosened. "So I am not the only crazy one," she said. Lucy shook her head hard. "No, you are not crazy," she said, "and you are definitely not dramatic. That was bad. I mean, as an IT person, I am supposed to be neutral, but as a human, I was yelling at the screen." Ellen snorted. "Welcome to the club," she said. Lucy took a breath. "The thing is," she went on, "security footage is supposed to be stored for 24 hours before it overwrites. Legally, we keep it longer now because of, lawsuits. But this morning, legal told us to prepare a deletion exception form." For that file, they said it was a privacy matter tied to a high-profile patient. High profile, Ellen repeated. That is one word for it. Lucy glanced at the ceiling camera, then back at Grace. I did not feel good about it, she said. So before anybody could sign off on deleting anything, I made a copy, off network, on a physical drive. You saved it, Grace said. Lucy nodded. It is not perfect, she said. It is just one angle, one camera. But it shows the hallway. It shows you on the gurney. It shows him and her and the timing. There is no audio, but honestly, it does not need it. Grace felt the weight of that sink in. The idea of seeing it again made her stomach twist, but the idea of it being gone entirely twisted something deeper. Why would you risk that for me? She asked quietly. Lucy shifted her weight, looking embarrassed. Because I have watched people with money make things vanish before, she said. And because if I were in your bed instead of out there in the control room, I would want someone to have my back. Machines do not lie. People do weird things to the truth all the time. She dug into her pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. This is for you, she said. Password protected. I can write it down, but it is simple. Your mom's last name and your birth year, spelled in words. Ellen raised an eyebrow. You dug through my records, she said. Lucy winced a tiny bit, she said, in a morally dubious but emotionally satisfying way. Despite everything, Grace gave a small laugh. Thank you, she said. She took the drive. It felt heavier than it looked. One more thing, Lucy said, backing toward the door. I know you have, a lot going on right now, what with the whole almost dying thing. But if you decide to ever use that footage, do not go alone. Find a reporter who scares rich people, or a lawyer who loves the word discovery. This should not be your solo mission. She paused. And just so we are clear, she added, if anyone asks, I did not tell you any of this. Of course, Ellen said, this entire conversation never happened in the most technical sense. Lucy nodded, relief blooming on her face. Good, great, she said. Okay, I am going to go pretend the printer is jammed, so I look busy. She slipped out. When the room was quiet again, Grace stared at the flash drive in her hand. Evidence. Proof. A piece of reality that could not be talked away. Document everything, she murmured, echoing Carter's words. Ellen watched her. You do not have to decide today, her mother said softly. But whenever you do decide, remember this. Your dignity is not a negotiation. It is not a favor someone gives you. It is yours. Grace closed her fingers around the drive. For the first time since the hallway, she felt something other than pure helplessness. She still hurt. She was still tired. She was still stitched together in more ways than one. But somewhere beneath all that, a thin, stubborn thread of resolve had started to form. The camera had not looked away. Maybe she did not have to either. Grace did not leave the postpartum floor for 2 more days, but her world got bigger anyway. It started with a name. Rachel Keene, Lucy said, leaning over the little rolling table in Grace's room like a conspirator. Investigative reporter. She did that piece last year on the hospital chain that was dumping patients on the sidewalk. Cold Dynamics hated her, which means I like her. Grace lay propped against the pillows, the flash drive resting on the blanket by her hand. Her incision hurt, her back hurt, her heart hurt in a way that did not show on any monitor. How do you know she will care about this? Grace asked. Because she has a thing for stories where power tries to crush someone smaller, Lucy said. Also because her email inbox is public and terrifying. I can help you send the video in a way that does not leave a trail straight back to your hospital room. Ellen sat in the visitor chair, arms crossed, watching them both. Walk me through the part where my daughter does not immediately get sued into the Stone Age, she said. Lucy pushed her glasses up. Step 1, she said, do not send anything from hospital Wi-Fi. Step 2, do not send it from your personal email either. Create a burner account, send the clip with as little identifying info as possible, and ask for a secure channel if she is interested. People think going public is just posting online. It is not. You can be smart about how you throw a grenade. Grace nodded slowly. Feels weird, she said, like I am planning a crime. Ellen shook her head. The crime already happened, she said. You are deciding whether to keep pretending you did not watch it. That landed somewhere right behind Grace's ribs. Okay, Grace said. Let us do it. Lucy grinned, quick and nervous. They used Ellen's phone tethered to a data connection Ethan did not control to create a new email address with a forgettable name. Lucy plugged the flash drive into a cheap loaner tablet she had brought up for patient education videos. Big tip, by the way, Lucy said as her fingers flew. If you ever end up in a situation where you are exposing someone powerful, rule one is protect yourself. Use secure channels. Use two-factor authentication. Tell at least one person you trust what you are doing, so you are not the only one holding the truth. Secrets are heavy. They are easier to carry when they are not just yours. That sounds like experience talking, Ellen said. Let us just say I have seen a few IT departments asked to quietly lose files, Lucy replied. I decided I like sleeping at night more than I like pleasing executives. She clipped the original hallway clip down to those 18 brutal seconds. Grace watched it again, because not watching felt more dangerous now than looking. Subject line, Ellen said. What do we write that makes a reporter open this instead of the other 400 emails she gets before breakfast? Lucy thought for a second. How about security footage from St. Mark's? Millionaire husband hugs PR director while wife in labor collapses, she said. Not subtle, but if you want someone to click, you feed the algorithm in their head. They sent it. For the rest of the day, nothing happened. Grace did her slow laps around the hall with a nurse at her elbow. She sat in a stiff chair beside Noah's incubator and whispered nonsense to him while he slept, his tiny chest rising and falling under a web of wires. Ethan appeared once, stood stiffly at the foot of the bassinet, and left after taking a single photo with his phone. By evening, Grace had almost convinced herself that the email had vanished into the internet void. Then Ellen's phone buzzed. Unknown number, Ellen said. Text only. She read it aloud. This is Rachel Keene. I received your clip. I believe you. Call me when you can talk safely. She included a signal number. Grace exhaled, something between a laugh and a sob. Okay, she murmured. That is something. They waited until late, when the hall quieted and the noise of televisions from other rooms dimmed. Ellen sat near the door like a lookout while Grace held the phone. Remember, Ellen said, you do not owe her every detail. You share what you are ready to share. Grace nodded and hit call. The connection clicked, then a low, calm voice came through, edged with newsroom energy. This is Rachel, the voice said. You are safe to talk for a few minutes. Is this Grace? Yes, Grace said. I am Grace Cole. A small pause. Thank you for trusting me, Rachel said. I saw the clip. I am so sorry you went through that. Can you tell me in your own words what we are looking at? Grace described the hallway, the contractions, the moment her eyes found Ethan and Madison at the end of the corridor. I was a nurse, she said. I've been in that hallway 1,000 times. I know what normal looks like. That was not normal. That was my husband holding another woman like I did not exist while I was being wheeled into delivery. Rachel listened without interrupting. When she did speak again, her questions were precise. Has your husband responded to you about this? She asked. He says I misinterpreted it, Grace said, that I am being dramatic, that she was comforting him after a stressful call. That context matters more than one frozen frame. And hospital administration, Rachel asked, have they addressed it with you at all? They are busy dancing around liability, Grace said. One doctor is on my side. One IT tech saved the footage. Everyone else wants this to quietly go away. Rachel's voice hardened just a fraction. Of course they do, she said. Here is the thing. With a clip like this, the story is going to write itself online. You cannot control how people react, but you can decide whether you stand in front of it with your head up or let your husband's public relations machine drive the narrative. Grace stared at the little plastic hospital bracelet around her wrist. What would that look like? She asked. It could be as simple as me verifying the footage, verifying your medical records, and publishing a piece that says, here is what happened, here is the timeline, here is the hospital's response, here is her side, Rachel said. No dramatization, just facts. Once it is out, burying it becomes very hard. And the risk, Grace asked? The risk is that he will come after you harder, Rachel said, not sugarcoating it. Legally, reputationally, men who are used to owning the story do not like losing control. But what he cannot say, once this is out, is that it is all in your head. They talked another 10 minutes. Rachel promised to verify the file's metadata, get an independent expert to confirm it had not been doctored, and contact the hospital for comment. Do not be surprised if they try to spin this as a misunderstanding, she said. They will use words like stressful circumstances and unfortunate optics. They will hope the public gets bored and moves on. Will they? Grace asked. Sometimes, Rachel admitted, but sometimes a story hits a nerve, and it sticks. You cannot predict which ones. You can only tell the truth and see what catches. When the call ended, Grace lay back, exhausted but strangely lighter. I think that was a victory, Ellen said. Feels like it, Grace replied. She slept hard that night, dreamless the way people do after running from something for a long time and finally stopping. The next morning, catastrophe came in a different form. Grace was in the neonatal unit, one hand resting inside the incubator so Noah could curl his fingers around her pinky when an alarm shrieked. The monitor over his bassinet flashed red. The nurse at the station was already moving, calling out numbers that made Grace's training kick in an instant. Heart rate dropping, the nurse said. Breathing shallow. We have desaturation. Grace's own heart lurched. What is happening? She demanded. Sometimes their lungs forget the assignment, a second nurse said, already adjusting the tiny mask on Noah's face. His little system might just be tired. Step back for a moment, Mom. Give us room. Grace stumbled back from the incubator as a respiratory therapist rushed in. Someone hit a code button. The unit, usually quiet and humming, snapped into sharp, efficient motion. For a horrible minute, Grace watched the numbers drop. Every second rewritten the future she had just started to imagine. Come on, baby, she whispered, hands pressed to her mouth. Come on, Noah. You do not get to leave, not after all of this. Dr. Carter appeared at her side like he had been summoned. I heard the alarm, he said. Okay, his lungs dipped. It happens. They are already bringing him back up. Is he dying? Grace asked, throat closing. If I thought he was dying, I would not be standing here talking to you, Carter said. I would be in there doing chest compressions on somebody the size of a loaf of bread. Deep breath, Grace. Watch the numbers. She forced herself to look. The heart rate that had dipped dangerously low began to climb, slow but steady. The oxygen saturation number followed, climbing from terrifying red back into reassuring green. See, Carter said quietly. He scared the hell out of us, but he remembered how to breathe. Grace realized her legs were shaking. It is like he is paying the price for my stress, she said. Carter shook his head. Do not do that, he said. Do not make this your fault. Premature lungs are drama queens. They pull stunts. That is on biology, not on you. He glanced sideways at her. Also, for what it is worth, if anyone tries to use this moment later to paint you as an unstable mother whose emotions endangered her child, that is a red flag the size of Texas, he added. Log it. Remember it. He managed a small, crooked smile. Also, you can quote me on this, he said. If gaslighting were a medical condition, half this city would be in the intensive care unit. Despite everything, a short laugh burst out of her. When Noah stabilized, the nurses relaxed, the tension bleeding out of the room like air from a balloon. Grace pressed her palm against the incubator wall. You do not get to scare me like that twice, she whispered to him. I am putting that in the rules. On the way back to her room, her phone buzzed in Ellen's hand. It is Rachel, Ellen said. Text message. She read it. Footage verified. Hospital declined detailed comment. Your husband's company issued a statement calling it a misunderstanding. My editor has approved the story. We go live tomorrow morning. Grace sagged against the wall for a second, relief and fear colliding. Tomorrow, she said. That is soon, Ellen replied. Which is good. Rip the bandage. For the rest of the day, that thought carried her through. Tomorrow the world will see. Tomorrow, this will not just live in my head and on one flash drive. Tomorrow, she told herself, I will not be alone with this anymore. She slept that night with the remote turned off and the television dark, trusting that the story would break without her watching it live. In the morning, she woke to a very different screen. Grace woke to the sound of voices, not the gentle murmur of nurses changing shift, but the clipped syllables of people who were used to conference rooms and quarterly earnings calls. She opened her eyes. Ethan sat in the visitor chair, suit jacket off, tie loosened just enough to look human. Beside him sat a man in a navy suit Grace did not recognize, legal pad balanced on one knee. Her stomach sank. "Good morning," Ethan said. His smile did not reach his eyes. "We need to talk." Grace pushed herself a little higher against the pillows, feeling the pull at her incision. "Who is this?" she asked. "Eric Hale," the man said smoothly. "Counsel for Cole Dynamics. I also handle some personal matters for Mr. Cole." Grace looked at Ethan. "You brought your lawyer to my hospital bed," she said. "That feels ominous." Ethan spread his hands. "I wanted to get ahead of things," he said. "We received an inquiry from a journalist named Rachel Keene last night. She claims to have obtained security footage from this hospital. She says it shows a, quote, compromising moment." "Compromising," Bravo, Grace repeated. "She asked for comment," Ethan went on. "We issued a statement. The hospital issued a statement. I am told she plans to run a story anyway." Eric leaned forward. "The story as we have seen it described is unflattering," he said. "It paints a picture of a husband neglecting his wife in labor. It uses loaded language to inflame public sentiment. Once it is out, it could damage not just Mr. Cole's reputation, but your child's privacy too." Grace stared at him. "You are worried about Noah's privacy," she said. "Your son will grow up in a world where everything is searchable," Eric said. "Do you want his name tied forever to a scandal headline?" The bitter irony of that almost made her laugh. "You did this," she said to Ethan. "You made the scandal. The camera just refused to lie about it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Grace," he said, "we are under attack here. Someone stole hospital footage. They are weaponizing it. I am trying to protect this family." There it was again, the word protect, twisted into something unrecognizable. "Let me guess," Grace said. "Your version of protection involves making sure nobody ever sees what you did." Eric cleared his throat. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "even if you feel hurt by how things looked in that hallway, going public will not heal that. It will just invite strangers into your marriage. And if it comes out that you were involved in distributing confidential medical footage, you could face legal consequences." "That sounds like a threat," she said. "More like a caution," he replied. "We can work this out quietly. Statement of unity, joint press photo when you are discharged. Show the world you are a solid front. Let the story die in a 48-hour news cycle." Grace imagined standing beside Ethan on a hospital sidewalk, holding Noah while cameras flashed, smiling like none of this had happened. The image made her skin crawl. "What if the story does not die?" she asked. "What if it sticks because people recognize something familiar? Because they see themselves in that hallway?" Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Do you know how many people have lived some version of this?" Grace said, voice shaking but clear. "The moment you realize the person who promised to be there is somewhere else entirely. The moment you are told you are overreacting to what you saw with your own eyes. It is not just my story. It is a lot of people's story. That is why it scares you." Ethan started to speak, but Eric put a hand up. "If you proceed with this," Eric said, "if you cooperate with Ms. Keene, we will have to respond. We have no choice. Right now, we have statements ready suggesting that you were under extreme stress, that you misinterpreted a moment of support between colleagues, that postpartum emotional instability may be a factor." Grace went cold. "You are going to call me crazy," she said. "Nobody is using that word," Eric replied. "We are talking about context, about humanizing what the camera cannot see." She thought suddenly of Dr. Carter's warning, of the way he had said, "If anyone uses your baby's medical scares to paint you as unfit, log it." "So that is the plan," she said softly. "You hug your mistress in a hallway, I hit the floor, and when a camera refuses to look away, you call me unstable." Ethan looked genuinely wounded for the first time. "She is not my mistress," he said. "Madison is my colleague. We have been under unbelievable pressure. I made a bad call on optics for 3 seconds. I will own that. But this witch hunt is insane." Grace almost laughed, a harsh sound. 3 seconds, and she said, you keep saying that like it makes it smaller. Do you have any idea how many lives change in 3 seconds? How many car crashes? How many diagnoses? How many choices people spend the rest of their lives living with? The door opened abruptly. Dr. Carter walked in, chart in hand, and stopped short when he saw the two men. Oh, good, he said. My favorite kind of morning. Lawyers in a patient room. Eric stood. We were just leaving, he said smoothly. Mrs. Cole knows our position. Excellent, Carter said. Now she can hear mine, which includes the radical idea that we let postpartum patients recover without ambush meetings. Ethan bristled. I am her husband, he said. Carter's gaze did not waver. Then act like it, he said. Give her time. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ethan grabbed his jacket, gave Grace one last searching look, and left with Eric in tow. When the door closed, Carter let out a slow breath. How are we doing? He asked. Apparently, I am dangerously emotional, Grace said. Good thing I have never grown a whole human and then watched him stop breathing for fun. Carter smiled, but his eyes were serious. Let me guess, he said. They are worried about context and your mental state and your son's privacy. And the news cycle, Grace added. He shook his head. Classic, he said. Step 1, minimize. Step 2, pathologize. Step 3, strategize. Step 4, blame the woman for not being more understanding. He set the chart down and looked at her. They will try to make you doubt yourself, he said. That is the game. For anyone listening to this later, here is your free life tip of the day. When someone hurts you and immediately pivots to how your reaction is the real problem, you are not the crazy one. Grace nodded, throat tight. Rachel's story goes live this morning, she said. She texted last night. She sounded determined. Good, Carter said. Sunlight is still the best disinfectant we have, even if it gives some people a rash. Ellen arrived a few minutes later, breathless, holding her phone like it was a live wire. It is up, she said. The story, it is everywhere. She set the phone on the tray table and turned the screen so Grace could see. An article filled the screen, headline bold and impossible to ignore. Millionaire hugs PR director as wife in labor collapses, hospital footage shows. Below it, a still frame from the hallway camera. Ethan's face turned toward Madison, arm around her shoulders. In the blurred foreground, Grace's hand reaching out as the gurney tilted. Grace's stomach flipped. Do you want me to read it? Ellen asked. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Ellen read aloud. The piece was not cruel. It was not tabloid. It laid out the timeline. Grace's admission to St. Mark's, the hallway moment, the collapse, the emergency surgery, Noah's time in intensive care. It quoted the hospital's carefully worded statement. It quoted Cole Dynamics' misunderstanding line. It quoted one unnamed staff member describing the mood on the floor as tense and sickened. It also quoted Grace, from her call with Rachel, in small, sharp sentences that felt suddenly bigger on the page. I am not looking for revenge. I am looking for reality to be acknowledged. Dignity is not a luxury. It is a baseline. By the time Ellen reached the end, her voice shook. Comments and reactions flooded in almost instantly. Screenshots of the article jumped to other platforms. Someone clipped the 18-second video and set it to slow motion. Strangers wrote things like, he did not even flinch, and you cannot spin that, and I have lived this, maybe not with cameras, but in my kitchen, at my dinner table. Grace felt something loosen in her chest she had not realized was clenched. They see it, she whispered. They really see it. For a few hours, it felt like a win. Friends texted privately, saying they believed her. Women she had not spoken to in years sent messages that started with, I am so sorry, and ended with, I wish I had spoken up when it was me. Even some men wrote in public comments, admitting they had been Ethan once, or had watched a friend be him and were ashamed. Then the counterattack began. Around midday, a different headline started circulating from an outlet that usually printed flattering profiles of people like Ethan. Sources say Grace Cole struggled with anxiety during pregnancy. Anonymous insider reveals fears about her emotional stability. A morning show host, all teeth and concern, asked on air, whether sharing such intimate medical moments online might be a sign of someone in distress. An unattributed quote surfaced, claiming Grace had once left a shift in the emergency room after a panic attack, as if that single moment defined her entire capacity to mother. Grace stared at the television in disbelief. "They are going after you," Ellen said, fury low in her voice. "They are really doing it." On the screen, a commentator tilted his head. "We have to remember," he said, "video does not tell the whole story. We do not know what was going on in that marriage. People make mistakes. Stress does things. We should be careful before we crucify a man over 18 seconds of tape, especially when his wife has a documented history of anxiety." Grace fumbled for the remote and turned the volume down before she threw it. "So now I am the unstable one," she said. Carter walked in just in time to hear that. "Of course you are," he said dryly. "You only grew a human and survived emergency surgery while being lied to on national television. Very suspiciously emotional behavior." He sat on the edge of the chair. "This is what we talked about," he said more gently. "The moment the story leaves your hands, they will try to twist you into the problem. This is why you document your sanity as carefully as you document your pain." Grace closed her eyes. "At least Rachel's article is still up," she said. "At least the footage is out. They cannot take that back." "About that," Ellen said quietly. Grace opened her eyes. "What?" she asked. Ellen reached for the overnight bag in the corner and pulled it onto the bed. She unzipped the front pocket, then the inner lining, where they had hidden the flash drive. Her fingers searched empty fabric. "It is not here," she said. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean it is not here?" she asked. "I mean this bag has been unzipped and rezipped, and the drive is gone," Ellen said. "I checked it last night when you were asleep. Today it is not where we left it." They both looked up, the same thought hitting them at once. Someone had gone through her things while she slept. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. "Lucy still has her copy," Grace said, grasping for something solid. "Rachel has a copy. The file exists. Losing this one does not erase the truth." "No," Elson agreed. It does not. But it tells us exactly how scared they are of that little piece of plastic." Grace stared at the empty pocket. For a second, all the earlier relief felt naive. She had thought sending the video to a reporter was the finish line. That once the truth was out, the story would finally stop being just hers to carry. She was starting to understand that this was not a sprint. It was the opening round of a much longer fight. The hospital cafeteria had never been loud enough to drown out a scandal. Until today. Grace sat in a wheelchair near the corner window, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket over her gown. Ellen pushed her there for a change of scenery, but the moment they entered, she felt the shift in the air. People whispered, not maliciously, not cruelly, but with that sharp, electric buzz that comes right after truth's first impact. Two nurses at a table paused their conversation as Grace rolled by. One murmured, "That's her," in a tone that held more sympathy than gossip. Another whispered, "I read the article twice. I would have collapsed too." Grace pretended she did not hear. Her face burned anyway. "Keep your chin up," Ellen murmured. "If they were judging you, they would whisper quieter. Loud whispers mean they are on your side." Grace huffed a small laugh. "Is that a rule?" "It is a mom rule," Ellen said. "We make them up, but they are almost always right." They parked beside the window. Outside, early spring rain streaked the glass. The hospital courtyard was empty except for a lone reporter trying and failing to interview a security guard who clearly had more patience than interest. Then Grace's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Grace, it's Rachel. We need to talk. Urgent." Grace's stomach tightened. She stepped away from the table, moving just a few feet for privacy. When she answered, Rachel's voice was all business. "I have two updates," she said. "One good, one not." "Start with the good," Grace said. "The story is exploding about," Rachel said. "Not in a tabloid way, in a human way. Women are sending thousands of messages, sharing similar moments. The footage is being reposted everywhere with commentary from family therapists, labor nurses, even social workers. It is sparking a conversation we have not seen in a long time." Grace swallowed. "And the bad?" Rachel exhaled slowly. "The Coal Dynamics is preparing a counteroffensive. They are calling senior publicists, leakers, influencers, even anonymous health experts willing to question your stability. They are also trying to push a narrative that the footage was taken out of context. That sounds expected, Grace said faintly. Here's the part that is not expected, Rachel continued. A law firm representing Coal Dynamics filed an emergency request this morning to petition the hospital for all patient security footage from that night, including anything with your face or voice. Grace froze. They want to prove you were unstable, she whispered. They want to drown the truth in noise, Rachel corrected. Not disprove it, distract from it, smother it. Grace pressed one hand against her abdomen, the incision tugging. What do I do? She asked. Stay calm, Rachel said. The hospital board is resisting. They do not want to look like they are bending to corporate pressure, but this may get messy. After the call ended, Grace returned to the table slowly. Ellen immediately saw her expression. What happened? She asked. Ethan is pushing harder, Grace said. They want all the footage. They want to twist everything they can. Ellen's jaw tightened. Of course they do. The truth is bad for business. Before Grace could respond, someone hurried toward them. It was Lucy. Her scrubs were wrinkled. Her hair was pulled into a bun that had given up halfway through her shift. She looked like she had sprinted across the hospital. Okay, Lucy said breathlessly. Emergency meeting. Well, not a meeting, more like an urgent gossip dump with high-stakes consequences. Grace blinked. What's wrong? Lucy dropped into the plastic chair beside them. Two things, she said. One, legal is losing its mind. Two, something is happening upstairs and you need to know before rumors get to you. Grace's pulse spiked. Well, start at the beginning, Ellen said. Lucy took a deep breath. First, your room was accessed at 2 this morning. Ellen stiffened. We know, she said. The flash drive disappeared. Lucy grimaced. I was afraid of that, but listen, that was just the warm-up. Second, and this is big, Coal Dynamics sent a representative to the director's office today asking him to publicly discredit the footage. Grace closed her eyes. Of course they did. Here's the weird part, Lucy said. The director said no, not because he is noble, more like because he is terrified of making the hospital look corrupt on the same day the story is trending. He said, and I quote, if I touch that footage, every nurse union within 5 states will eat me alive. Grace stared. He really said that? Pretty much, Lucy said, but it gets crazier. Lucy leaned in. Someone on the board, someone high up, asked to see the original copy. Grace felt a chill roll across her skin. Why? She whispered. Because they think something worse might be on that camera, Lucy said. Not him hugging Madison. Something before that, or after it, something the public has not seen yet. Grace's breath caught. What could be worse? No idea, Lucy said. But if the board wants to review it themselves, that means they're worried the truth is bigger than one 18-second clip. Grace leaned forward. Lucy, is there more footage? Lucy hesitated. I do not know for sure, she said. But yes, probably. Cameras do not start recording just for scandal moments. They run all the time. You saw 18 seconds. The system stores hours. A cold wave washed over Grace. Hours. Hours of Ethan and Madison together in that hallway. Or worse, hours of what they said after she collapsed. 1,000 questions crowded her mind. Were they laughing? Were they whispering? Did Madison say something cruel? Did Ethan blame her? Or a thought so sharp it made her dizzy. What if he said something like, she will believe whatever I tell her, Grace whispered. Lucy nodded grimly. That is the kind of thing the board is afraid of leaking, she said. Not cheating, manipulation, coercion, anything that makes the hospital look complicit. Holy hell, Ellen muttered. This is bigger than we knew. Lucy reached across the table and grabbed Grace's hand. Whatever happens, she said, you are not crazy, you are not unstable, and you are not alone. You have half the internet on your side right now. And me, and your mom, and that sarcastic doctor with the tragic haircut. Grace laughed weakly. That is accurate. Also, quick side note, Lucy said, your husband is currently pacing the lobby like a malfunctioning Roomba. It is kind of hilarious. You are trending #1 on Twitter, and he is trending #4 under worst timing ever. Grace snorted. Good, good, Ellen echoed. Then a nurse from the neonatal unit appeared at the cafeteria entrance. Mrs. Cole, she called. Grace's heart stopped. Is it the baby? She asked. No, the nurse said quickly. He is okay, but you will want to come. Grace stood so fast she swayed. Ellen caught her elbow. What is it? She asked. The nurse hesitated. There is someone asking to see the baby, she said. He says he is the father. Grace's face hardened. Absolutely not, she said. You need to come to the unit, the nurse said. Dr. Carter is already there. Grace gripped the wheelchair handles and let Ellen guide her as fast as her weak legs allowed. The cafeteria noise faded. The hall grew too bright. Her pulse hammered, because this was not about a flash drive or a video anymore. It was about control. And Ethan had just tried to take the one thing Grace refused to let him touch, her son. The neonatal intensive care unit was usually quiet, lit by soft blue monitors and whispering machines. Today the air throbbed with tension. Dr. Carter stood near the incubator, arms crossed, expressions set to the particular brand of fury only doctors and mothers can access. His jaw worked slowly, like he was biting down on something bitter. Across from him stood Ethan, hands shoved into his pockets, trying and failing to look paternal. 3 nurses watched anxiously from behind the desk. When Grace entered, Carter turned to her immediately. Good, he said. You are here. This conversation needs your voice. Ethan pivoted. His expression flickered. Guilt, anger, fear, but settled on something approximating concern. Grace, he said, I just wanted to check on my son. Grace stepped between him and the incubator. You do not get to touch him today, she said. Not when you showed up with your lawyer and threatened me an hour ago. Ethan's face tightened. I was trying to protect you, he said. Protect us. Carter snorted. If that was protection, I would hate to see sabotage. Ethan glared at him. This is a family matter, doctor. No, Carter said. This is a medical ward with strict protocols, including parental access guidelines, and right now your presence is increasing the mother's blood pressure. That means it is my business. Ethan's jaw clenched. Grace steadied herself with the edge of the incubator. You cannot just walk in here and demand to see him, she said. You do not even know how to pronounce the medical terms on his chart. Do not do this, Ethan said. Do not turn my son against me because you are angry. Carter blew out a breath. Okay, he said, let us pause, because I am having a very strong urge to prescribe sedatives to someone who is not my patient. He stepped closer to Ethan, lowering his voice but not the menace behind it. You need to leave, Carter said, and not for later. Now. Ethan stepped forward. He is my son. He is a premature infant in critical care, Carter said, and your face is upsetting his mother during her recovery. That is enough reason. Grace watched them, a surreal calm washing over her, like she was floating above the scene, watching 2 men argue about her life while the machines hum quietly beside her son. She hated that feeling. She hated how small it made her feel. She straightened. Ethan, she said, leave. He froze. What? Leave, she repeated. This is my space, my recovery, my son, and you bring chaos every time you walk in. He stared at her, something raw flickering in his expression. This is because of the article, he said, because she used your words without context, because the internet decided I am a villain. This is because of the hallway, Grace said softly. Everything else came after. Ethan shook his head. You are emotional, he said. This is postpartum. You need time. We need to talk through this without reporters and gossip blogs twisting every frame. Grace felt her breath catch. She looked at Carter. He nodded once. Remember what we talked about, he said. If someone hurts you and immediately pivots to telling you your reaction is the problem, you are not the unstable one. Grace looked back at Ethan. Get out, she said. Something in Ethan finally cracked. The cold polish he wore like armor slipped, revealing something sharper beneath. This is not over, he said. No, Grace replied. It is just beginning. He hesitated, then turned and walked out of the unit. The moment the door closed, Grace's knees buckled. Carter caught her elbow. Sit, he said. Slow breaths. Ellen rushed to her other side. Baby, you okay? She asked. Grace nodded shakily. I just, that was the second time today everything felt like it was collapsing, she whispered. First the article, then the flash drive, now this. Carter nodded. That is trauma math, he said. One event divides into three. It never hits once. Lucy appeared in the doorway, breathless again. I heard yelling, she said. Do we need witnesses or popcorn? Grace gave a shaky laugh. No, she said, but thank you. Lucy approached the incubator, checking the monitors instinctively. Noah's levels stayed stable, she murmured. That is good. He did not pick up on the chaos. Grace placed her hand on the warm plastic. I am so tired, she whispered. Carter crouched beside her. Then here's your actionable advice of the day, he said softly. Rest when you can, fight when you must, and do not confuse the two. Grace nodded, tears prickling. I think the next fight is coming, she said. Carter gave a grim smile. Oh, it absolutely is, he said. But so is your support. You have people now. And one very loud baby. Grace looked at Noah's tiny chest rising and falling, and she felt it. The thing that had been missing. Resolve. Not anger, not revenge, not fear. Resolve. This ends, she whispered, when the whole truth comes out. Lucy straightened suddenly. Oh, she said, small detail I forgot to mention. You know how the board asked to see the security footage? Grace looked up sharply. Yes? They just found something, Lucy said. What kind of something? Lucy swallowed. The kind, she said, that changes everything. They reconvened in Grace's room because that was the only place she could sit without feeling like the floor shifted under her feet. Lucy paced near the window, chewing her thumbnail. Ellen sat upright in the visitor chair, back straight, hands folded like she was bracing for impact. Dr. Carter leaned against the wall near the door, arms crossed. Okay, Grace said finally. Someone say it. What did the board find? Lucy stopped pacing. She looked at Grace, then at Carter, then back at Grace. You remember how I said cameras do not just record one moment, she began. They record everything. Yes, Grace said slowly. Well, anyway, Lucy went on, the board asked me to pull a longer clip. They wanted the 2 minutes before your collapse and the 2 minutes after. That makes sense, Carter said. Context. Exactly, Lucy replied. So I pulled it, and there is more. A lot more. Grace's mouth went dry. Just tell me, she said. Lucy took a breath. After you went down, she said, after they rushed you through the doors, your husband and Madison did not exactly look distressed. Grace's heart pounded. What do you mean? Lucy looked miserable. I mean, she said slowly, that on the footage, you see the gurney disappear into the delivery room, the nurse yelling, the doors swinging shut. Then the hallway goes quiet. Ethan stands there for a second like he is deciding what to do. Madison steps closer. They talk. I cannot hear the words, but their faces are not exactly panicked. Grace gripped the blanket. Then what? She whispered. Then Madison pulls a folder out of her bag, Lucy said. She opens it. There is a pen. Ethan takes it. He signs something. Right there, in the hallway. While you are emergency surgery. Carter swore under his breath. You are sure? He asked. Lucy nodded. You can see the document clearly enough to zoom in on the top line, she said. I did not do it. One of the board members did. They used a still frame and enhanced it. The header reads, Provisional Asset Trust Agreement, Coal Dynamics letterhead, Madison's name. Ellen's face went pale. An asset transfer, she said, while his wife was on the table. Grace's mind spun. He was signing money away, she said, to her at that exact moment. Lucy nodded again. Best guess, she said, it is some kind of trust or backup plan. Maybe moving assets out of reach, maybe setting up a safety net for himself that does not include you. Grace stared at the blanket for a long moment. It was one thing to know he had betrayed her heart. It was another to realize he was already moving pieces on a financial chessboard while she lay open on an operating table. That is not just cold, Carter said quietly. That is strategy. Ellen's voice shook with anger. Does the board understand what that looks like? She asked. Because if the public saw that clip, this would not just be about a hug. It would be about a man protecting his money while his wife and child would almost die. Oh, they understand, Lucy said. That is why they lock the extended footage behind about 10 layers of security. They are terrified of being seen as accomplices if this ever gets out. Grace closed her eyes. She could see it now in her mind, the way the story would look if that second tape leaked. The hug, the collapse, the signing, all in one sequence. Her stomach turned. So that is it, she said. That is the worst thing. The thing they were afraid of. Lucy hesitated. Maybe, she said. What do you mean, maybe? Ellen asked sharply. I mean, Lucy said, they did not let me watch past those 2 extra minutes. They cut it off. I do not know what else is on there. But honestly, we may not need more. What we already have is devastating for him. Grace sat very still. For a strange, brief second, she felt almost nothing. No rage, no sadness, just a blank, cold clarity. So now what? She asked. Now we do something a lot of people forget to do, Carter said. We breathe. We do not act in the 5 minutes after new trauma. That is when people make stupid choices and send emails in all caps. He looked at Grace. Here is your actionable advice for the day, he said. When you learn something that shakes your whole reality, give it 24 hours before you decide what it means for your life. Pain is loud. Truth needs a minute to settle in. Grace almost smiled. You really like giving homework, she said. Only because therapy is more expensive, he replied. They did not get 24 hours. They barely got 6. By late afternoon, Rachel called again. 2 updates, she said. 1 hopeful, 1 ugly. Grace sat up in bed, bracing herself. Go with hopeful first, she said. The story is not fading, Rachel said. It is growing. Mental health advocates are piling on. Labor and delivery nurses are doing explainer videos on what support should look like. You have unintentionally kicked off a national conversation on emotional abandonment during labor. And the ugly? Grace asked. Rachel was quiet for a beat. Your husband filed an emergency motion in family court, she said. He is seeking temporary primary custody on the grounds that you are, quote, mentally and emotionally unfit in the wake of trauma. Grace's breath left her body. What? She whispered. He is arguing that your decision to, quote, recklessly share medical footage and cooperate with journalists shows poor judgment, Rachel said. He is using the media storm as evidence that you cannot properly shield your child from harm. For a long moment, Grace could not speak. Can he do that? She finally asked. In America, Rachel said, anyone can file a motion. Winning it is another question. But I will not lie to you. He has money, lawyers, and a team that wants to make an example of you. Grace looked at Noah's empty bassinet beside the bed, waiting for him to be wheeled back from a test. He wants to take my son, she said. He wants leverage, Rachel said. Control. Custody is a weapon in some men's hands. You are not the first woman to face this, and you will not be the last. Grace swallowed hard. What do I do? She asked. For one, Rachel said, get a lawyer of your own. Not his, not the hospital's, yours today. Second, remember this. You are not a hashtag. You are a patient who almost died and a mother whose child almost died. No judge in their right mind will ignore that. The extended footage, if it ever surfaces, will not help his case. Grace closed her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. When the call ended, she looked at Ellen. He is going after custody, she said. Ellen's face went hard in a way Grace had only seen once before, the day her father left. Then we fight, Ellen said simply. Carter came back in as if summoned by tension. Updates? He asked. Ethan filed for emergency custody, Grace said. Apparently my reality is very bad for his brand. Carter blew out a breath. Of course he did, he said. The moment some men feel consequences, their first move is to grab whatever they think will hurt most. He dragged the visitor chair closer and sat. Listen carefully, he said. I am not your lawyer, but I have testified in custody hearings, and I know this much. Judges do not like games that use sick babies as chess pieces, and they do not like men who try to pathologize women while ignoring their own behavior. Grace nodded, but her hand still shook. He is going to stand in court and call me unstable, she said. He is going to say I am too emotional, too reactive, too broken. Then you let him talk, Carter said, and you let the tape talk louder. He leaned forward. Here is your universal experience moment, he said. At least half the people who hear your story will recognize themselves in some part of it. Being doubted, being called overreactive, being painted as crazy when they were just hurt. That recognition is powerful. Do not underestimate how much it shapes what happens next. Grace felt tears gather, but this time they did not feel like surrender. They felt like fuel. I am scared, she said simply. Good, Carter replied. Scared people are careful. Careful people write things down, talk to lawyers, ask for help. Reckless people are the ones who think they can spin reality forever and get away with it. He stood. Rest, he said. Hold your son when they bring him back. Then tomorrow we start the next round. Grace lay back against the pillow. Through the window, the city moved like nothing had changed. Cars crawled. People crossed streets. Somewhere down below, someone laughed at a joke, not knowing that on the 7th floor, a woman was trying to figure out how to protect her child from the man who had once promised to protect them both. She looked at the tiny bassinet, waiting. You and me, kid, she whispered. We are going to walk through fire, but we are walking through it together. Outside her door, a red camera light blinked over the hallway, watching, recording, refusing to look away. Grace stood outside the family courthouse, holding her son's carrier against her chest. Noah slept peacefully, unaware that the next hour could reshape the rest of his life. Ellen touched her daughter's shoulder. You breathe, she said softly. Just breathe like Carter taught you. Grace nodded, inhaling slowly, letting her ribs expand. Her reflection in the courthouse glass looked steadier than she felt. She was wearing a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes determined. A woman who had survived an operating table, a media storm, and the shattering truth of a second tape. Lucy rushed up the steps, clutching a binder thick with documents. I got everything, she said. Hospital statements, timestamps, the letter from the board attorney, and Carter's affidavit. It is not the extended footage, but it is enough to show pattern, intent, and negligence. Grace exhaled. Thank you for everything. Lucy smiled weakly. I am not your lawyer, but I am your friend. And today, I am your evidence mule. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy with neutral silence, the kind judges cultivate on purpose. Ethan sat at the opposite table, flanked by two suits and one woman in a gray blazer who looked like she could cross-examine God. Madison was not present, but Grace spotted a familiar folder in Ethan's briefcase, the one Madison had held that terrible night. The bailiff called the session to order. Judge Rosemary Walsh entered, her presence both calm and razor-sharp. We are here for an emergency custody request, she said, filed by Mr. Ethan Cole regarding infant Noah Cole. I have reviewed preliminary filings. Counsel, proceed. Ethan's attorney stood. Your Honor, Hayden began, my client seeks temporary primary custody due to concerning behaviors exhibited by Mrs. Grace Cole. Specifically, Grace's attorney, Marianne Porter, interrupted smoothly. Objection. Statement of conclusion without evidence. Noted, the judge said. Proceed with facts only. The attorney adjusted his tie. The mother has collaborated with media outlets, allowed the spread of sensitive hospital footage, and demonstrated emotional instability following childbirth. Grace's jaw tightened. The attorney continued. Mr. Cole is worried about the environment the child will be raised in. He believes Mrs. Cole is prioritizing drama over the well-being of their son. Grace whispered, Drama. Ellen squeezed her hand. Then Marianne stood. Your Honor, I would like to respond with actual evidence. She walked to the center of the room, calm, unshakable. First, my client did not leak any footage to the media. That footage was released by hospital staff in response to a corporate attempt to bury evidence of misconduct. She placed a folder on the judge's bench. Second, Mrs. Cole was unconscious for most of the night in question. She could not have orchestrated anything. She was literally fighting for her life. Marianne turned. And third, we submit the hospital report verifying that Mr. Cole was not present to support his wife during medical distress. despite having been in the hallway. Instead, she lifted a still frame from the footage. He was otherwise occupied. Ethan stiffened. Judge Walsh leaned forward. That is a serious implication, Ms. Porter. It is supported by timestamps, video stills, and witness testimony, Marianne said. Furthermore, we have affidavits from hospital personnel describing Mr. Cole's immediate actions after Mrs. Cole lost consciousness. What actions? The judge asked. Mr. Cole engaged in a financial transaction, Marianne said, sliding another still frame across the bench. Signing documents for a trust transfer while his wife underwent emergency surgery and his son's life hung in the balance. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to custody. Judge Walsh raised an eyebrow. Timing reflects priorities. Continue, Ms. Porter. Marianne nodded. Finally, she said, we have character statements from the attending physician, Dr. Carter, affirming Mrs. Cole's mental stability, trauma recovery progress, and dedication to her child. She stepped back. Your Honor, this is not a mother in crisis. This is a mother who survived crisis. The courtroom held still. Judge Walsh turned to Ethan. Mr. Cole, she said, custody motions require clean hands. I am not convinced you have them. Ethan swallowed. Then the judge turned to Grace. Mrs. Cole, she said softly, do you wish to speak? Grace stood. Her voice was quiet but steady. Yes, Your Honor, just one thing. She stepped to the center. The night my son was born, I almost died. He almost died. And I woke up to a world that kept saying I had made the story messy by existing inside it. She took a breath. I am not unstable. I am a survivor. And I will not apologize because my survival inconveniences my husband's reputation. A hush fell. Grace continued. My son deserves safety. He deserves love. And I will spend my life giving him both. But I will not let anyone, husband, corporation, or court, use him as a bargaining chip. Judge Walsh studied her for a long moment. Then she spoke. Emergency custody request is denied. Full maternal custody remains in place. Mr. Cole, you may file for visitation once you complete a psychological evaluation and parenting course. Ethan's face collapsed. And, the judge added, this court strongly advises you to reconsider your legal strategy before causing further harm to your family. The gavel came down. It was done. Grace felt her knees weaken. Ellen caught her. Lucy cried openly. Marianne nodded with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had just dismantled an empire using bullet points. Outside the courthouse, sunlight broke through the clouds. Grace lifted Noah's carrier and whispered, You're safe. For the first time, she believed it. 3 months had passed. Grace opened the door of her small new townhouse, the first home she had ever chosen entirely on her own. Soft morning light filled the hallway. The air smelled like fresh coffee and warm cinnamon, a scent Ellen insisted made babies calmer. Ellen was right. Noah giggled from his high chair as Ellen fed him mashed bananas. Your mommy is late to her own celebration, Ellen teased. Grace entered the kitchen carrying a stack of mail. Only because someone, she said, kissing Noah's forehead, woke up at 3 in the morning demanding a philosophical conversation about ceiling fans. Noah squealed proudly. Grace smiled. Life was ordinary, blessedly ordinary. Rachel arrived next, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. This is for you, she said. No cameras, no interviews, just a gift. Grace opened it. Inside was a framed photo printed from a still. Grace holding Noah in the hospital, both of them wrapped in morning light. Under it, Rachel had printed one line. You survived. That is the story. Grace's eyes burned with tears. Thank you, she whispered. Lucy arrived carrying a bottle of champagne and a bag of groceries. Okay, she announced. Today's agenda. 1. Celebrate that Noah is healthy. 2. Celebrate that Ethan's appeal was dropped. 3. Celebrate that we all collectively destroyed a man's PR machine using only morals, stubbornness, and a hospital camera. Ellen sighed. Lucy, honey, try not to say destroyed with the baby in the room. Lucy knelt and whispered to Noah, Sweetheart, never destroy, just firmly dismantle. They laughed. The house was small, but warmth filled every corner. Later, when the others chatted in the living room, Grace stepped onto the back porch with her cup of tea. The sky above her was a soft blue, the kind that looked like forgiveness. She heard footsteps. Dr. Carter appeared with a container of muffins. "They are store-bought," he said. "Therapists are not allowed near ovens." "Liability issues." Grace laughed. "You came," she said. "Of course," Carter said. "You made it out of the labyrinth. That deserves carbs." He leaned on the railing. "How do you feel?" he asked. Grace considered the question. "Tired," she said, "but not the kind of tired that comes with fear. The kind that comes after finishing something impossible." "Good," Carter said. "Here's your final wisdom moment. People think healing is a beginning. It is not. Healing is a closing, a door that stops slamming, and after it closes, you get to decide what opens next." Grace looked through the window at Noah waving his toy at Ellen. She smiled softly. "I choose peace," she said. "That," Carter replied, "is the smartest choice anyone ever makes." He started to leave but paused. "One more thing," he said. "You did not just survive. You changed something. That footage, that story, it pushed hospitals to review their support protocols. It sparked new training modules. You did that by existing. That is no small thing." Grace swallowed hard. "Thank you," she said. When Carter left, Grace walked back into the house. Noah reached for her, babbling happily. She lifted him into her arms, feeling his warmth settle against her. "Hey, little miracle," she whispered. "Guess what? We are free." She kissed his forehead, and he smiled. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, laughter filled the air. The fire was behind them. And home. Home was the quiet afterward. Charlton.